Welcome back to the Dark Index. Tonight, we're venturing into America's heartland, where endless cornfields stretch beyond the horizon, where farmhouses stand isolated against vast skies, and where the silence itself seems to whisper warnings. This isn't the Midwest you see in postcards. This is the Midwest that locals refuse to discuss after sunset, where generations have learned that some questions are better left unasked, and some roads are better left untraveled. The Great Plains region, spanning Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, represents some of the most productive agricultural land in North America. Millions of acres of corn, wheat, and soybean fields create a patchwork landscape that feeds much of the nation. But beneath this pastoral image lies something far more disturbing. Rural farming communities across these states harbor secrets that have festered for decades, passed down through whispered warnings and unspoken rules that outsiders never understand until it's too late. Tonight's cases come from sealed county records, suppressed police reports, and testimonies from families who've finally broken their silence. These aren't urban legends embellished around campfires. These are documented incidents involving missing persons, unexplained phenomena, and patterns of terror that have plagued specific locations for generations. Each story we'll examine tonight shares common threads: isolation, repetition, and the disturbing realization that some presences never truly leave the land they claim. Our first case takes us to Heartland County, Nebraska, population 3,423. The year was 1987, and the Peterson family had just purchased 640 acres of prime farmland at an unusually low price. The property included a main farmhouse built in 1902, 3 outbuildings, 2 grain silos, and approximately 400 acres of tillable corn and soybean fields. The remaining acreage consisted of pastureland and a small woodlet bordering Prairie Creek. David and Margaret Peterson moved onto the property in early March with their 3 children, Sarah, 16, Michael, 13, and young Emma, just 7 years old. David had worked as a farm manager for nearly 2 decades and saw this purchase as the culmination of years of careful saving. Margaret, a former elementary school teacher, planned to homeschool the children while managing the household. On paper, everything appeared perfect. The property inspection revealed no structural issues. The soil quality reports exceeded expectations. The water table was strong and reliable. But there was something the previous owners hadn't mentioned. Something the real estate agent conveniently omitted from the listing. Something the neighbors knew but wouldn't discuss with outsiders until they'd proven themselves trustworthy. A process that typically took years in this close-knit farming community. The first incident occurred during their second week on the property. Sarah, the eldest daughter, was helping her father inspect the eastern cornfield one evening around dusk. The field had been left fallow the previous season, and they were assessing what work would be needed for spring planting. As they walked between rows of dried, dead stalks from years past, Sarah stopped abruptly and grabbed her father's arm. "Dad, someone's standing at the tree line," she whispered, her voice tight with sudden fear. David turned to look where she pointed. The woodlet stood roughly 300 yards distant, a dark mass of oak and cottonwood trees silhouetted against the deepening purple sky. He saw nothing unusual, just trees and shadows blending in the fading light. He told Sarah it was probably just a deer or her eyes playing tricks in the poor light. But Sarah insisted. She described a tall figure, human in shape, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching them. David retrieved binoculars from the truck and scanned the tree line carefully. He saw nothing. No movement, no figure, nothing that couldn't be explained by the natural shapes of trees and undergrowth. He reassured his daughter, and they continued their inspection. But as they worked their way back toward the farmhouse, Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, and David noticed she walked closer to him than usual. That night at dinner, Sarah mentioned the incident to the family. Young Emma asked if it might be a scarecrow, which made everyone laugh and seemed to break the tension. Michael teased his sister about being scared of shadows. Margaret reminded everyone that adjusting to rural life took time, especially after living in town. David agreed, noting that the isolation and vast open spaces could play tricks on urban eyes not accustomed to such emptiness. But the sightings didn't stop. 3 days later, Michael saw the figure. He'd been working in the barn, organizing tools and equipment that the previous owners had left behind. It was mid-afternoon, full daylight, perfect visibility. When he stepped outside to carry a load of scrap metal to the trash pile, he froze. There, standing motionless in the middle of the western cornfield, was a tall silhouette. Even from 200 yards away, Michael could tell it was human-shaped. Too tall and narrow to be an animal, too still to be a person doing normal work. Michael dropped the metal with a crash that echoed across the yard. The figure didn't react. It simply stood there, facing the barn, absolutely motionless. Michael ran back into the barn and grabbed his father, who'd been working on a tractor engine in the equipment shed. Together, they hurried outside, but by the time they reached the spot where Michael had been standing, the field was empty. David walked 100 yards into the cornfield, checking between the rows, looking for any sign of whoever had been there. The dried stalks were brittle and noisy. Anyone walking through them would create obvious sounds and leave a clear trail of broken vegetation. David found nothing. No footprints in the soft soil, no broken stalks, no evidence anyone had been standing there at all. That evening, David drove into town to the local hardware store. He needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed to talk to people who knew the area. The store owner, a weathered man named Earl who'd run the business for 40 years, helped David load fence posts and wire into his truck. As they worked, David casually mentioned the property they'd purchased, the old Henderson place, though the Petersons hadn't known that name. Earl's friendly demeanor changed instantly. His smile faded, and he became noticeably more reserved. "You bought the Henderson farm?" Earl asked, his tone careful and measured. David confirmed, sensing the shift in atmosphere. He asked if there was a problem with the property, something he should know. Earl was quiet for a long moment, glancing around to see if other customers were within earshot. The store was empty except for a teenage employee stocking shelves in a far aisle. Earl set down the wire spool he'd been holding and looked directly at David. "The Hendersons lived there for 60 years, Earl said quietly. 3 generations. Good people, hard workers. But they had rules about that property. Strict rules. And they never, ever talked about why." David pressed for details, but Earl wouldn't elaborate. He simply advised David to talk to the Hendersons directly. They'd moved to a retirement home in Lincoln after selling the farm. Earl provided the name of the facility but offered nothing more, returning to their transaction with forced pleasantries that felt hollow compared to his earlier warmth. As David drove home in the growing darkness, he noticed that the last 5 miles to his property took him past several farms. Not a single one had exterior lights on, despite the late hour. Every farmhouse sat dark and silent as he passed. That night, Margaret woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. The old farmhouse had wooden floors that creaked distinctively, and she'd already learned to recognize the different sounds. David's heavy tread, the children's lighter steps, the particular groan of certain boards. These footsteps were different, slower, more deliberate, and heavier than David's despite her husband sleeping soundly beside her. She listened, frozen, as the steps moved across the porch from one end to the other. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Robert asked before David could even explain why he was calling. David admitted that strange things had been happening. Figures in the fields, footsteps on the porch, unusual behavior from animals. Robert was silent for several seconds, and David could hear the old man's labored breathing on the line. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "We should have told you before we sold. But nobody would buy it if we did, and we couldn't afford to keep it anymore. My son won't work that land. My grandchildren won't even visit. We broke something out there, Mr. Peterson. My grandfather broke it in 1934, and we've lived with the consequences for 3 generations." Robert Henderson's story began in the depths of the Dust Bowl, when the Great Plains were dying and thousands of families were abandoning their farms. In 1934, his grandfather, Samuel Henderson, was barely holding on to the property. Crops had failed for 3 consecutive years, and the topsoil was literally blowing away in massive dust storms that turned day into night. Livestock were starving, banks were foreclosing on properties throughout the county, and desperation had become a tangible presence in every farming community. Samuel had heard rumors about old practices, folk magic that pioneer settlers had brought from Europe and adapted to American soil. Specifically, rituals meant to protect crops and ensure prosperity, practices that predated Christianity and were rarely discussed in polite company. These weren't the harmless superstitions like hanging horseshoes or planting by moon phases. These were darker traditions, agreements made with things that were never clearly defined, bargains that required specific payments and created obligations that extended beyond a single generation. According to Robert, his grandfather performed a ritual in the eastern field one night in late September 1934. Samuel had obtained instructions from a woman in the county who practiced what she called old country farming. A widow named Mrs. Olska, whose own farm had somehow maintained productivity while neighboring properties turned to dust. The ritual required specific items: soil from a crossroads, water from a source that never ran dry, ash from burned corn husks, and something living to be buried at the field's center point. Samuel used a rooster, according to family history. He buried it alive at midnight in a hole exactly 6 feet deep, along with the other items, while speaking words in a language Robert claimed his grandfather didn't understand. Phonetic phrases Mrs. Olska had written down for him. Samuel then marked the 4 corners of the field with stakes driven into the ground and soaked in a mixture of blood and water. The ritual promised 7 years of protection and prosperity in exchange for acknowledgement and respect. And it worked. While neighbors' farms continued to fail throughout the rest of the Dust Bowl years, the Henderson property produced modest but consistent crops. The corn grew when it shouldn't have, the wheat yielded when others' fields stood barren, and the soil retained moisture that seemed to come from nowhere. By 1941, when the rains finally returned to the region and the Dust Bowl ended, the Hendersons had managed to hold onto their farm while dozens of surrounding properties had been abandoned or foreclosed. But the 7 years of prosperity came with conditions. Samuel discovered these rules through trial and error, and later, through a final visit from Mrs. Olska before she died in 1943. The field required acknowledgement, a specific phrase spoken aloud each planting and harvest season. Certain times of day were forbidden for field work. Nobody should be in that eastern field between sunset and full dark. And most importantly, whatever appeared in the field as a result of the ritual was never to be approached, challenged, or acknowledged directly. Its presence was the price of the bargain, and confronting it would void the agreement with consequences Robert's grandfather had been too terrified to fully explain. Samuel followed these rules religiously. He taught them to his son, Robert's father James, who followed them with equal dedication. James, in turn, attempted to teach them to Robert, but by the time Robert inherited the farm in 1981, Modern agriculture had transformed farming into a business of efficiency and science. The old superstitions seemed ridiculous in the age of GPS-guided tractors, computer-controlled irrigation, and hybrid seed varieties. Robert had a college degree in agricultural management. He wasn't going to whisper nonsense phrases at dirt or avoid perfectly good farmland because of century-old folk tales. The first year Robert ran the farm without following the old rules. Nothing obvious happened. The crops grew normally, yields were average, and life continued. Robert felt vindicated in his decision to abandon the superstitious practices of his grandfather's generation. But in the second year, the sightings began. Workers reported seeing a figure in the eastern field, always in the same location, always standing motionless. At first, Robert assumed it was trespassers or teenagers playing pranks. He called the sheriff's department several times, but deputies never found anyone despite thorough searches. Then the accidents started. 3 different farmhands quit within a single month, all refusing to work the eastern field. One claimed something had grabbed his ankle while he worked, though no one else was near him. Another reported hearing his name called repeatedly from empty rows of corn, a voice that sounded like his deceased father. The third quit after finding his truck's engine running one morning despite having definitely turned it off the night before. With the driver's seat adjusted for someone much taller than himself, Robert's wife Linda began experiencing the footsteps on the porch, the same methodical pacing Margaret Peterson would hear decades later. Their dog refused to go outside after dark. Their children started having nightmares about a tall man standing in their bedroom doorways, watching them sleep. The breaking point came in the summer of 1984. Robert's youngest son, Nathan, who was 12 years old at the time, went missing for 6 hours. He'd been playing near the barn after dinner when Linda called the family inside. Nathan didn't come. Robert searched the immediate property, then expanded his search to the outbuildings, then the fields. He called neighbors, then the sheriff. Within 2 hours, 40 volunteers were combing the property, calling Nathan's name, checking every possible location a child could hide or become trapped. They found Nathan at midnight, standing in the center of the eastern field, exactly where Samuel Henderson had buried the rooster 50 years earlier. Nathan was facing the farmhouse, completely motionless, staring straight ahead. He didn't respond to his name being called. He didn't react as his father ran to him, grabbed him, shook him. When Nathan finally seemed to wake from whatever trance held him, he had no memory of the previous 6 hours. He remembered playing by the barn, and then suddenly he was standing in the field with his father crying and shaking him, surrounded by searchlights and people. The doctor who examined Nathan found nothing physically wrong. No injuries, no signs of trauma, no neurological explanation for the lost time. But Nathan was never the same afterward. He became withdrawn, refused to sleep alone, and would wake screaming from nightmares he couldn't describe. Most disturbing were the drawings. Nathan began compulsively drawing the same image over and over. A tall, thin figure with no discernible features, standing among vertical lines that represented corn stalks. Sometimes he drew one figure, sometimes dozens, all watching the house from different angles. After Nathan's incident, Robert swallowed his pride and visited Mrs. Oleska's daughter, trying to find information about the original ritual and how to manage or end it. The daughter, herself elderly by this point, was reluctant to discuss her mother's practices. But seeing Robert's desperation, she finally shared what she knew. The ritual her mother had taught Samuel Henderson was indeed protective in nature, but it didn't create protection, it bargained for it. Something had agreed to guard the eastern field in exchange for acknowledgement and specific protocols. As long as those protocols were followed, the arrangement remained stable. But breaking the agreement, Robert needed the money from the sale to afford appropriate care for his declining years. So he listed the property, priced it attractively, and when David Peterson made an offer, Robert accepted. He told himself that perhaps the presence had faded over the decades, that maybe whatever his grandfather had summoned had finally departed, that the new owners might never experience what his family had endured, that he was wrong. And now, listening to David describe the same sightings, the same footsteps, the same animal reactions that Robert's own family had experienced, the old man felt the full weight of his decision to remain silent during the sale. "There are rules you need to follow," Robert told David over the phone that morning in 1987. "If you follow them precisely, you can live on that property safely. My family did it for decades, but you must follow them exactly, without deviation, and you must teach them to your children. This isn't something that goes away, Mr. Peterson. It's something you learn to live with or you leave." Robert provided detailed instructions. The acknowledgement phrases had to be spoken aloud at the center of the eastern field at dawn on the day of spring planting and again at dusk on the day of fall harvest. The words were nonsensical, a mixture of what sounded like corrupted German, Slavic languages, and something older that Robert couldn't identify. They had to be spoken exactly as written, pronunciation precisely matched to Robert's recorded version, which he promised to mail on cassette tape. Fieldwork in the eastern section was permissible only between sunrise and 1 hour before sunset. No one should be in that field during the transitional hours of dusk. If anyone saw a figure standing in the field, they were to acknowledge it with a simple nod if it was during approved hours, then continue their work without approaching or speaking to it. If it appeared during forbidden hours or anywhere except the eastern field, everyone should immediately go indoors and remain inside until full daylight. The rules extended to other aspects of property management. No development or construction could occur on the eastern field's center point, marked by a specific GPS coordinate that Robert provided. The barn doors should be closed and latched every night without exception. All exterior lights should be turned off by 10 p.m., creating darkness that allowed the presence its privacy. And most crucial, no one should ever attempt to photograph, record, or directly investigate the figure if it appeared. Doing so constituted a challenge, a direct confrontation that would escalate the situation unpredictably. David wrote everything down meticulously, asking clarifying questions, seeking to understand the logic behind each rule. Robert was patient but firm, emphasizing that logic wasn't relevant. These rules had been developed through trial and error over 3 generations, refined by his grandfather, father, and himself. They worked, and that was all that mattered. Attempting to rationalize or modify them based on modern understanding would be catastrophic. Margaret was skeptical when David relayed the conversation. She had a master's degree in education, believed in rational explanations, and found the entire concept of following nonsensical rules based on folk magic absurd. But David was more pragmatic. They'd invested their life savings into the property. Leaving wasn't financially feasible, and whether the phenomenon was genuinely supernatural or some elaborate psychological effect didn't ultimately matter. Something unusual was definitely happening, and Robert's family had successfully managed it for decades. Following a few harmless protocols seemed a small price to pay for peace of mind. The cassette tape arrived 3 days later, along with a handwritten document containing all the rules, coordinates, and dates. That evening, David gathered the family and explained the situation. Sarah and Michael were old enough to understand the gravity of what he was saying. Emma, only 7, struggled with the concept but grasped that there were new house rules that everyone had to follow, like not entering certain areas at specific times. The following Sunday at dawn, David stood at the center point of the eastern field with the cassette player, following Robert's instructions exactly. He listened to the old man's voice, carefully pronounced the acknowledgement phrase 3 times, then repeated it himself as precisely as possible. The words felt strange in his mouth, neither fully foreign nor recognizable, syllables that seemed to resist proper pronunciation. The air was cold, and mist rose from the field around him, creating an atmosphere that felt both ethereal and vaguely threatening as David spoke the final repetition. He experienced something he would never fully be able to explain. The quality of silence changed. The ambient sounds of morning, distant bird calls, wind rustling through dried corn stalks, the far-off hum of a highway, all seemed to pause for exactly 3 heartbeats. In that suspension of normal reality, David felt observed with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Not watched from a distance, but examined intimately, as if something was standing inches behind him, studying the back of his neck with focused attention. Then the sounds returned, and the moment passed, leaving David shaking and covered in cold sweat despite the physical exertion being minimal. He walked back to the farmhouse on unsteady legs and told Margaret it was done. He didn't describe the sensation he'd experienced. Part of him worried that speaking it aloud would somehow invalidate the ritual or invite further contact. Another part simply couldn't find words adequate to convey the profound unease that brief moment had generated. Margaret noticed his pallor and shaking hands but attributed it to early morning cold and stress. She made coffee while David showered, trying to wash away the lingering feeling of being examined by something fundamentally other than human. For the next 2 months, life proceeded normally. Spring planting went smoothly, fieldwork progressed on schedule, and no unusual incidents occurred. The children adjusted to their new rules without significant complaint. Sarah and Michael both understood they were to stay out of the eastern field during the hour before sunset. Emma, who loved exploring, was restricted to areas within sight of the house unless accompanied by an adult. Duke, the family dog, resumed his normal behavior, barking at passing vehicles and chasing rabbits across the yard. The Petersons began to relax, to believe that perhaps Robert Henderson's protocols actually worked, that they'd successfully established whatever agreement or acknowledgement was necessary. David even felt somewhat foolish about his dramatic reaction during the ritual. In the mundane light of daily farm work, the entire situation seemed less ominous, more manageable. They were simply following unusual house rules, nothing more supernatural than any other family tradition or superstition. But in late May, during a severe thunderstorm, something happened that shattered their growing sense of security. The storm hit around 9 p.m., earlier than the weather service had predicted, with winds gusting over 60 miles per hour and hail that shattered one of the barn's small windows. David and Michael ran to the barn to secure equipment and check on the animals. Margaret stayed in the house with the girls, watching the storm through the kitchen window while lightning illuminated the fields in stark flashes of white. During one particularly bright lightning strike, Margaret saw something that made her blood freeze. Standing in the eastern field, roughly 200 yards from the house, was a figure. The lightning flash lasted only a second, but the image burned into Margaret's retinas with perfect clarity. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with proportions that were almost human but subtly wrong. The arms were too long, reaching past where knees should be. The head seemed too small for the body, or perhaps too smooth, lacking the details of hair and features that should have been visible even in silhouette. And it was facing the house, motionless despite the violent winds that were bending trees and sending debris tumbling across the yard. The lightning faded, plunging everything back into darkness. Margaret stood frozen at the window, waiting for the next flash, simultaneously desperate to see again and terrified of what confirmation might mean. When lightning struck again several seconds later, the field was empty. No figure. There had been no rule breaking, no provocations, nothing that should have triggered this appearance so close to the house. David called Robert Henderson the next morning, describing Margaret's sighting in detail. The old man was quiet for a long time after hearing the account, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of concern that made David's anxiety spike even higher. "The storm," Robert said slowly. "During severe weather, the boundaries become less stable. My father warned me about this. Electrical storms, particularly violent ones, can temporarily disrupt whatever parameters contain it. The rules still apply, but during storms, it can roam more freely. This is why we always locked ourselves inside during bad weather. Not just for normal storm safety, but because those nights were unpredictable." Robert added this to the protocol. During severe weather warnings, the entire family should remain indoors from sunset until sunrise, with all doors locked and curtains drawn. Don't look outside during storms. Don't respond to any sounds that might come from the porch or yard. Wait for daylight and calm weather before resuming normal activities. The presence used storms for reconnaissance, Robert explained, checking its territory, assessing the current occupants, ensuring its boundaries remained respected. "What exactly is it?" David asked, finally voicing the question he'd been avoiding. "What did my grandfather actually summon?" Robert's answer was frustratingly vague. His grandfather Samuel had never clearly understood what the ritual contacted. Mrs. Olska had called it a landvedi, an Old Norse term for land spirit or land wight, a type of entity that inhabited and protected specific territories. But whether it was truly a spirit, some undiscovered natural phenomenon, or something else entirely, Robert couldn't say. His family's knowledge was purely practical. Here are the rules that keep you safe. Follow them precisely. Don't ask questions that can't be answered. "Does it harm people?" David pressed. "If we follow the rules, are we truly safe?" Robert hesitated before answering. "My family followed the rules for 60 years after my grandfather made his mistake. None of us were physically harmed. But Nathan, what happened to Nathan wasn't physical harm, Mr. Peterson. It was something else. Something that left marks we couldn't see but could never forget. The rules keep you safe in body. I can't promise they keep you safe in every way that matters." That conversation changed everything for David. This wasn't just an unusual phenomenon to be managed. It was a genuine threat that could affect his children in ways he couldn't predict or prevent. He and Margaret discussed selling the property, cutting their losses, and finding somewhere else to start over. But the financial reality was brutal. They'd spent everything on the down payment and initial property improvements. Walking away would mean bankruptcy, destroyed credit, and years of financial recovery. They had no choice but to stay and hope that Robert's protocols were sufficient that as spring turned to summer, the Petersons settled into an uneasy routine. Everyone followed the rules without exception. Fieldwork was scheduled carefully to avoid forbidden hours. Storm warnings sent the family scurrying indoors with all protocols observed. The acknowledgement phrase was spoken at appropriate times with precise pronunciation. Life continued, interrupted occasionally by sightings that became almost routine. A figure in the eastern field during approved hours, standing motionless, always in roughly the same location, always facing the house. Sarah, the eldest daughter, struggled most with the situation. At 16, she was old enough to understand the full implications of what they were dealing with, but young enough to feel trapped and resentful. Her friends from her previous school lived normal lives, worrying about typical teenage concerns, grades, relationships, college plans. Sarah's life revolved around strange rules, avoided fields, and an entity that occasionally watched their house from the darkness. She began keeping a journal, documenting every sighting, every unusual occurrence, approaching the situation with a methodical determination to understand what they were dealing with. In early July, Sarah made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Despite explicit warnings from both parents, despite understanding the rules, despite knowing the potential consequences, she decided to photograph the figure. Her reasoning seemed logical to her teenage mind. If she could document its appearance, perhaps they could get help. Maybe experts in paranormal phenomena or researchers, or someone with more knowledge than the Hendersons could provide solutions. Maybe there was a way to end this rather than simply managing it forever. She waited for an afternoon when her parents were in town buying supplies, when Michael was visiting a friend, and when Emma was napping. Sarah took her camera, a nice 35mm film camera she'd received for her birthday, and walked to the eastern field. It was 3 in the afternoon, well within approved hours, and she could see the figure standing in its usual location, approximately at the field's center point. She approached to within about 75 yards, close enough for a clear photograph but maintaining what she thought was a respectful distance. The figure stood exactly as it always did, motionless, impossibly tall, facing her direction, though she couldn't discern any features that would indicate eyes or a face. Sarah raised the camera, framed the shot carefully, and pressed the shutter button. The camera's mechanical click seemed abnormally loud in the quiet afternoon air. She advanced the film and took a second photograph, then a third, wanting to ensure she captured clear images. The moment she took the third photograph, the figure moved. It didn't turn or walk or make any motion that followed normal physical mechanics. It simply relocated instantaneously, blinking from its original position to a spot 50 yards closer in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure remained motionless in its new position, still facing her, and even at this closer distance, its features remained frustratingly indistinct. A dark silhouette that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. A void in the shape of something that might once have been human. Sarah backed away slowly, her camera clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on the figure. It didn't move again, but she could feel something had changed. The air felt heavier, the afternoon sunshine seemed dimmer, and a pressure was building behind her eyes like the onset of a severe headache. She backed away for another 20 yards, then turned and ran for the house, her heart hammering, gasping for breath, terrified to look behind her but more terrified of what she might see if she did. She reached the house and slammed the door behind her, locking it with shaking hands. Emma woke from her nap, crying at the sudden noise. Sarah sat on the floor with her back against the door, trying to control her breathing, trying to process what had just happened. The figure had moved. Robert Henderson had never mentioned it being capable of movement, had never described it relocating instantaneously. Was this normal behavior they simply hadn't witnessed before, or had her photographs triggered a response? When David and Margaret returned an hour later, Sarah was still sitting by the door, pale and shaking. The story spilled out of her in a rush. The photographs, the figure's movement, the overwhelming sense that she'd made a terrible mistake. David's face went through a progression of emotions. Confusion, understanding, then horror as he grasped what his daughter had done. Margaret simply closed her eyes, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. David immediately called Robert Henderson, explaining what had happened. The old man's response was immediate and unequivocal. Develop those photographs immediately and burn them. Don't look at them, don't try to scan them, don't examine them in any way. Just burn them, and pray that destroying the images is sufficient. David drove Sarah to the nearest one-hour photo development shop, 40 minutes away in the county seat. They waited in anxious silence while the film was processed. When the clerk returned with the envelope of photographs, David paid without looking at Duke, the normally brave farm dog, hid under Michael's bed and wouldn't come out despite repeated calls. Around 3 a.m., something knocked on the front door. Not a polite knock, but a heavy, deliberate pounding that shook the door in its frame. 3 impacts, pause, 3 more impacts, pause, 3 more. The pattern repeated for 20 minutes while the Peterson family sat frozen. No one willing to approach the door. No one certain what would happen if they acknowledged the presence directly. Eventually, the knocking stopped, the footsteps resumed their circular path, and finally, around dawn, everything went silent. David stood at the living room window and carefully pulled back the curtain to look outside. The porch was empty, the yard deserted, and the eastern field showed no standing figure. Everything appeared normal, as if the night's terror had been collective hallucination. But on the porch, directly in front of the door, was a single item that hadn't been there before. Sarah's camera. The same camera David was certain they'd left in the truck. It sat centered precisely on the welcome mat, lens facing the door, as if it had been carefully placed as a message or warning. David retrieved the camera without opening it to check the film. Following Robert's advice, he drove it to a remote section of the property's back acreage and buried it 6 feet deep, marking the location so he could ensure no one ever accidentally unearthed it. The camera was never mentioned again in the Peterson household, and Sarah's interest in documenting or understanding the presence died permanently that night. She'd learned the same lesson her father and the Henderson family before them had learned. Some things resist investigation, and attempting to study them only draws unwanted attention. The summer proceeded with heightened tension. Everyone followed the rules more carefully than before, hyper-aware that violations had consequences that extended beyond the immediate incident. Sarah withdrew socially, spending most of her time in her room, her journal abandoned after filling half its pages with observations she now wished she'd never made. Michael became more nervous, frequently checking windows and doors, asking repeatedly if it was safe to go outside. Emma, too young to fully understand, sensed the adult's anxiety and became clingy, rarely leaving Margaret's side. In August, a county deputy arrived at the property investigating a missing person report. A local teenager named Travis Redmond had disappeared 3 days earlier. He'd told friends he was going to explore the haunted Henderson farm on a dare. His truck had been found parked on a county road bordering the Peterson property's southern edge. Travis himself was nowhere to be found. David's heart sank as the deputy explained the situation. Travis had apparently been part of a local teenager's tradition, testing bravery by trespassing on the property after dark, trying to spot the figure that old stories claimed haunted the fields. The deputy asked if the Petersons had seen anything unusual, any sign of trespassers, any evidence someone had been on the property. David said no, which was technically true. They'd been following the storm night protocol religiously, staying indoors with curtains drawn, deliberately avoiding any knowledge of what happened outside after dark. Search teams combed the property for 2 weeks. They found no trace of Travis Redmond. No clothing, no footprints, no evidence he'd ever actually entered the property despite his truck being found at its border. The official conclusion was that Travis had probably walked away from his vehicle and met with misfortune elsewhere. Perhaps fallen into Prairie Creek and drowned, perhaps been struck by a vehicle on the dark county roads. His family knew better but couldn't articulate why. Rumors circulated in town, the kind of whispered speculation that never made its way into official reports but everyone understood implicitly. The Henderson farm had claimed another victim, old-timers said. They'd warned their children and grandchildren to stay away from that property for decades. The rules weren't just protocols for residents, they extended to everyone. Trespassing after dark, particularly with intent to mock or challenge the presence, was an invitation for consequences that no search team would ever uncover. Travis Redmond's name joined a list of similar disappearances spanning back to the 1930s, all connected to that property, all officially unexplained, all understood by locals as the price of disrespect and boundary violation. David felt crushing guilt despite having no direct responsibility for Travis's choices. He wondered if he should have posted warning signs, if he should have notified the sheriff's department about the presence, if there was anything he could have done to prevent this tragedy. Margaret reminded him that posting signs admitting to paranormal activity would have made them subjects of ridicule at best and investigation at worst. The practical reality was that they could warn people about dangerous machinery or unsafe structures, but how could they warn about something that defied rational explanation? Any attempt to publicize the presence would either be dismissed as insanity or attract exactly the kind of attention that created incidents like Travis's disappearance. The terrible truth was that some knowledge had to remain local, passed through community understanding rather than official channels, and outsiders who ignored local warnings bore the consequences of their ignorance. Fall arrived with harvest season, bringing the requirement for David to perform the acknowledgement ritual's second annual component. On the day of harvest, at dusk, David returned to the eastern field's center point with Robert Henderson's cassette tape. The field had produced an excellent corn crop despite David's minimal intervention. The soil was indeed as productive as promised, yielding crops that exceeded county averages without unusual fertilizer or irrigation requirements. Whatever Samuel Henderson had bargained for in 1934 was still providing tangible benefits alongside its intangible costs. David stood at the designated spot as the sun touched the horizon, bathing the field in orange and red light. He listened to Robert's recorded voice, then repeated the acknowledgement phrase precisely 3 times, letting the strange syllables roll off his tongue more smoothly than they had in spring. The words were becoming familiar, almost comfortable, which disturbed him. How quickly the abnormal could become routine, how easily human beings adapted to circumstances that should be intolerable. As he spoke the final repetition, David experienced the same sensation as before, the sudden suspension of ambient sound, the intense feeling of being observed from impossibly close range, the 3 heartbeat pause in reality. But this time, something additional happened. As the sounds returned and the moment broke, David heard a voice. Not words exactly, and not heard with his ears precisely, but impressed directly into his consciousness. Acknowledged. The voice was neither male nor female, neither old nor young, and somehow managed to sound exactly like silence given phonetic form. David's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He stumbled backward, caught himself, then walked quickly from the field, resisting the overwhelming urge to run. Behind him, he felt certain something was following at a distance, not threatening but observing, assessing, ensuring he completed the ritual properly and departed the sacred ground respectfully. David told no one about the voice. Not Margaret, not Robert Henderson, not anyone. Some experiences were too intimate with strangeness to share, creating isolation that couldn't be bridged even with loved ones who shared the same general situation. David had heard something speak, and that changed his understanding of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just an entity or phenomenon. It possessed something approximating consciousness, awareness, perhaps even agency. Could respond, communicate, acknowledge them in return. That winter was harsh, with temperatures dropping below 0 for extended periods and snowfall exceeding seasonal averages. The family stayed indoors for weeks at a time, leaving only for essential errands, maintaining the house and livestock but avoiding unnecessary exposure to brutal conditions. The eastern field lay dormant under deep snow, and sightings ceased entirely. For months, life felt almost normal. The presence seemed to hibernate, or perhaps the snow and cold created barriers that even it couldn't easily cross. But in early March, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, they weren't traditional nightmares with monsters or violence. Instead, she dreamed of standing in the eastern field at dusk, watching herself and her family in the farmhouse through the windows. The perspective was from outside looking in, observing them eating dinner, watching television, moving through their evening routines. And she understood, in the dream, that this was what the presence did every night. Stood in its field and watched them, learning their patterns, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. "It knows us," Sarah said quietly. "It knows everything about us because it watches all the time. And I don't think it's just watching anymore. I think it's getting curious. I think it wants to understand us better, and that's not a safe progression." Margaret reported this conversation to David, who called Robert Henderson seeking guidance. The old man listened carefully to the description of Sarah's experiences, and his response was grimmer than anything he'd previously shared. "This is what happened to Nathan," Robert said heavily. "The dream started first, then the blank periods, then the incident where we found him in the field. The presence doesn't just observe, Mr. Peterson. It studies. And when it becomes particularly interested in someone, usually one of the younger family members, it starts testing boundaries. Seeing how close it can get, how much influence it can exert, whether it can draw them out to its territory." Robert explained that his son Nathan had never fully recovered because the presence had, for lack of better terminology, touched his mind during those lost 6 hours. Whatever examination or interaction had occurred left Nathan permanently sensitized to things most people couldn't perceive. He saw patterns in randomness, heard whispers in silence, felt presences in empty rooms. He'd lived with therapists and medications for years before finally finding some equilibrium, but he was never truly normal again. And he absolutely refused to visit rural areas, to be anywhere near farmland, to risk encountering anything similar to what had marked him as a child. "You need to keep Sarah away from that field," Robert instructed. "Don't let her near it alone. Don't let her be outside during transition hours. Keep her grounded in normal activities and social connections. The presence targets isolation and curiosity. Keep her busy. Keep her connected to her peers. Keep her focused on her future away from that property. Once she leaves for college, the attention should transfer elsewhere or dissipate." David and Margaret implemented new protocols specifically for Sarah. She wasn't to be alone on the property at any time. Her bedroom door was to remain open at night with a parent sleeping in the nearby guest room. They encouraged her social life, even though it meant driving her to and from friends' houses in town, 40 minutes each way. They pushed her to focus on college applications, visit campuses, and plan her escape from the farm that had become a prison. Sarah endured these restrictions with understanding beyond her years. She'd seen enough, experienced enough, to know her parents weren't being overprotective. They were being prudent. The thing in the field had taken interest in her, first because of her photographing attempt, now for reasons less clear. She could feel it sometimes, a pressure at the edge of her awareness, a sensation of being the subject of intense focus from something that thought and patterns human minds weren't designed to comprehend. In May, the Peterson family had a visitor, Earl, the hardware store owner who'd first warned David about the property's history. He arrived unannounced one Saturday afternoon, driving his old pickup truck down their long driveway and parking in front of the house. David met him in the yard, surprised but welcoming. Earl apologized for the intrusion but said he'd been thinking about them, worrying, feeling guilty about not providing more explicit warnings when they'd first moved in. "I told myself it wasn't my business," Earl said, his weathered face creased with concern. Told myself that maybe new people, new energy, maybe things would be different. But I've been hearing things in town, and I can see it in your face, Dave. It's not different, is it? David admitted the struggles they'd been facing, the protocols they were following, the toll it was taking on the family, particularly Sarah. Earl nodded grimly, as if confirming suspicions he'd held but hoped were unfounded. He explained that he'd grown up in the county, remembered the Henderson family through 3 generations, and recalled other families who'd attempted to farm that property in the years before Samuel Henderson purchased it in the 1920s. The land had a reputation extending back to pioneer times, though stories varied about the source of its strangeness. Some old accounts claimed the location had been a Native American sacred site, a place where shamans performed rituals and made offerings to territorial spirits. Other stories suggested the land had been a site of tragedy. A family murdered there in the 1870s. Bodies never properly buried, spirits never properly laid to rest. Still, other versions claimed the issue was geological or environmental. Something about the specific intersection of underground water, mineral deposits, and electromagnetic properties that created conditions conducive to paranormal activity. Truth is, nobody knows, Earl said. Could be all those things, could be none of them, could be something nobody's ever thought of. But what matters is the pattern. That property consumes families. They arrive hopeful, they struggle for a few years following whatever protocols they learn, and eventually they leave broken. The Hendersons lasted the longest because Samuel got the ritual right from the beginning. But even they couldn't sustain it across generations. That land doesn't want to be farmed by people who resent it, who follow rules out of fear rather than respect. It wants believers, or it wants to be left alone. Earl offered to help David sell the property, even though he knew finding a buyer who understood the situation would be nearly impossible. Most locals wouldn't touch it at any price. Outside buyers would be purchasing blind to the reality, repeating Peterson's situation. The only real solution, Earl suggested, was to sell it to a corporation for commercial agriculture. Large-scale farming operations managed by rotating crews who never stayed long enough to become targets of sustained attention. David thanked Earl for the visit and the advice, promising to consider all options. But privately, he felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. They couldn't afford to sell at a loss, couldn't find buyers who'd pay fair market value once they understood the property's reality, and couldn't simply abandon the land without facing financial ruin. They were locked into their situation until Sarah finished high school and they could reassess with at least one child safely away from the property. That summer was the longest of David's life. Each day felt like walking a tightrope, balancing necessary farm operations against protocols designed to avoid triggering unwanted attention. Sarah's dreams continued but didn't escalate. The figure appeared regularly in the eastern field but didn't approach closer or exhibit threatening behavior. Life continued in a state of managed terror, sustainable but deeply unhealthy, corroding the family's well-being in ways that wouldn't be fully apparent for years. In August, Sarah left for college, accepting admission to a university 300 miles away. The entire family helped move her into the dormitory, and David saw visible relief in his daughter's face as they drove away from the farm. She was texting friends before they reached the highway, already reconnecting with normal teenage life, already beginning to heal from 2 years of psychological strain. David envied her escape and dreaded returning to the property that held the rest of them captive. With Sarah gone, the presence's attention shifted to Michael, now 15 and increasingly resentful of the restrictions governing his life. Unlike his sister, Michael responded to the situation with anger rather than fear. He resented the entity in the field, resented the rules controlling his activities, resented his parents for having bought the property in the first place. His teenage rebellion took forms both normal and dangerously specific to their circumstances. Michael began deliberately testing boundaries. He'd walk near the eastern field during forbidden hours, not entering it but standing at. Michael saw his parents' absence as an opportunity on the second night they were gone. Michael waited until his aunt and Emma were asleep, then took a flashlight and walked directly to the eastern field at midnight. He decided to confront the presence directly, to demand answers, to treat it as an entity capable of communication rather than something to be feared and avoided. His logic was that if David's ritual involved speaking to it, then conversation must be possible. If Robert Henderson's family had coexisted with it for decades, then negotiation must be feasible. Michael was tired of being controlled by something he didn't understand and wasn't allowed to investigate. He reached the field's center point, where he knew the ritual spot was located, and stopped. The night was clear, with a half moon providing enough illumination to see the field stretching around him in all directions. He called out, his voice sounding small and fragile in the vast open space. "I know you're here. I know you watch us. I want to understand why. I want to know what you want." The silence that followed was absolute. No wind rustled the corn. No insects chirped. No distant sounds of traffic or animals penetrated the bubble of quiet surrounding Michael. He stood waiting, his flashlight pointed at the ground, his heart hammering despite his determination to appear fearless. Minutes passed with no response, no appearance, no acknowledgement of his presence. Michael tried again. "We follow your rules. We do the rituals. We stay away when we're supposed to. But why? What are you? What happens if we stop?" This time, the response was immediate. The temperature dropped so rapidly that Michael's breath became visible clouds. The moonlight seemed to dim, as if something was absorbing the illumination, and the figure appeared, not gradually emerging from darkness but simply existing where it hadn't been a moment before, standing 15 feet from Michael, between him and the house. Up close, the figure was profoundly wrong in ways Michael's mind struggled to process. It maintained the basic silhouette of something human-shaped, but the details refused to resolve into coherence. Where a face should be was a darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward, a void that suggested depth beyond physical possibility. The body was there and not there simultaneously, present but somehow existing partially in space normal vision couldn't quite access. Michael stumbled backward, his teenage bravado evaporating instantly in the presence of something his evolved instincts recognized as fundamentally threatening. The figure didn't move, didn't approach, but Michael felt pressure building inside his skull. A sensation like thoughts that weren't his own trying to force their way into his consciousness. Not words, not images, but concepts too complex and alien for human cognition to comfortably contain. The pressure increased until Michael thought his head might literally split. He clamped his hands over his ears uselessly. This wasn't sound, wasn't anything his hands could block. He fell to his knees in the dirt, gasping, tears streaming down his face, begging for it to stop. And abruptly it did. The pressure released, the temperature normalized, and when Michael looked up, the figure was gone. He was alone in the field under normal moonlight, surrounded by the natural sounds of a farm at night. Michael ran for the house, his flashlight forgotten on the ground where he'd dropped it. He reached the porch and collapsed, vomiting into the bushes beside the steps, his body rejecting the experience his mind couldn't process. His aunt found him there 20 minutes later, attracted by the noise, and immediately called David and Margaret in panic. Michael was conscious but unresponsive, staring straight ahead, trembling violently. The aunt called 911, and an ambulance transported Michael to the county hospital. David and Margaret drove through the night, making the 7-hour trip in just over 5 hours, arriving at the hospital as dawn broke. Michael had been admitted for observation, diagnosed with an anxiety attack or possible seizure. The doctors found no physical abnormalities, brain scans were normal, blood work showed nothing unusual, neurological exams revealed no deficits. But Michael remained partially catatonic, responding minimally to questions, refusing to make eye contact, flinching at shadows and sudden movements that it took 3 days before Michael spoke coherently. When he finally described what happened, his voice was flat and emotionless, as if he were recounting someone else's experience. He described the confrontation, the figure's appearance, and the sensation of something trying to communicate by forcing concepts into his mind that human consciousness wasn't designed to hold. He couldn't describe what those concepts were. Attempting to recall them caused immediate distress, but he was certain of their reality. "It wasn't trying to hurt me," Michael said quietly. "It was trying to answer my questions. But the answers are too big. They're not shaped like words or thoughts. They're shaped like trying to pour an ocean into a teaspoon. It didn't understand that it was breaking me just by trying to communicate." The neurologist suspected a psychotic break, possibly triggered by stress, possibly indicating emerging mental illness. She recommended psychiatric evaluation and treatment. But David knew better. This was what had happened to Nathan Henderson, what had nearly happened to Sarah, what would keep happening to anyone who pushed too hard against the boundaries the presence maintained. It didn't harm people deliberately. It harmed them accidentally, through contact that human neurology couldn't withstand. Michael was discharged after a week with prescriptions for anxiety medication and referrals to therapists. He returned to the farm changed, no longer rebellious or curious, instead displaying the careful wariness of someone who touched a high-voltage line and learned that some boundaries existed for good reason. He followed protocols rigidly, avoided even looking toward the eastern field, and spent most of his time indoors. His personality had flattened, his spark diminished, and David grieved for the confident, curious son who'd been replaced by this cautious, damaged version. Sarah called weekly from college, and David never told her what had happened to her brother. She didn't need that weight added to her own recovery. She was thriving at school, making friends, engaging with normal college life, and David desperately wanted to protect that normalcy. One child had escaped intact. Michael's situation made it even more critical that Sarah never felt obligated to return. The fall harvest came and went with David performing the acknowledgement ritual, speaking the phrases mechanically, feeling none of the hope or satisfaction that harvest season should bring. The crops were excellent again. The land provided abundantly in exchange for the psychological toll it extracted from those who worked it. David began to hate the property with an intensity that surprised him. Every bushel of corn, every successful yield felt like blood money. Profit purchased with his family's well-being. In November, David contacted a corporate agricultural firm that managed large-scale farming operations. He explained he had productive land he was interested in leasing or selling, omitting any mention of the property's peculiarities. The company sent representatives to assess the acreage, and they were impressed with the soil quality and recent yield data. They offered a long-term lease arrangement with an option to purchase, proposing to manage the land with rotating crews and industrial equipment. David accepted immediately, despite the terms being less favorable than he'd hoped. The agreement included a provision allowing the Peterson family to continue living in the farmhouse while the corporation managed agricultural operations. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it removed the daily burden of field work and the necessity of David personally maintaining the protocols. The corporation's crews would work the land without understanding its requirements, would probably experience strange phenomena, but wouldn't be there long enough to become targets of sustained attention. The transition occurred in early December. The corporation sent a management team to survey the property and plan the following year's operations. David briefed them on basic farming considerations while carefully saying nothing about the actual dangers they'd be facing. It was still there. David saw it sometimes in the eastern field, standing among the massive tractors and industrial equipment, but it seemed diminished, less defined, as if the corporate farming operation was bulldozing right through supernatural boundaries through sheer oblivious force. By summer, the corporate operation was producing yields that exceeded even the property's historical standards. The company was delighted with their investment and began discussing expanding their lease to include neighboring properties. David felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. Perhaps they could actually survive this situation intact. Perhaps breaking the old protocols through industrial-scale farming was inadvertently accomplishing what deliberate confrontation never could, reducing the presence to irrelevant background noise overwhelmed by human activity. Michael began to slowly recover, engaging more with family, showing interest in activities beyond basic survival. He started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, and while he couldn't explain the source of his trauma honestly, the cognitive behavioral techniques still helped him manage anxiety and rebuild coping mechanisms. He'd never been the same boy who'd arrived at the property, but he was finding a new equilibrium that allowed functional daily life. Emma, now 11, had adapted to the situation with the resilience of childhood. She followed the rules without understanding their full significance, treated the presence as something like weather, an environmental factor to be accommodated rather than something that required deep analysis. Her relative ignorance seemed to protect her. She'd never developed the fearful awareness that plagued her older siblings. By fall, the Peterson family was discussing exit strategies. Sarah would graduate college in 2 years and had no intention of ever returning to farm country. Michael was researching colleges as far from Iowa as possible, looking at schools in major cities where farmland was something you drove past on highways rather than lived surrounded by. Emma was too young for immediate plans, but David and Margaret agreed they'd sell the property before she reached high school, moving to town where normal lives were possible. The only question was Robert Henderson's reaction to the corporate farming arrangement. David had maintained occasional phone contact with the old man, but he'd never mentioned transitioning property management to a corporation or abandoning the traditional protocols. In October, he finally made that call, expecting anger or warnings of dire consequences. Instead, Robert laughed. A dry, bitter sound, but genuine amusement nonetheless. "You accidentally stumbled onto the solution my family never considered," Robert said. "We thought we had to maintain the relationship Samuel created, keep following the rules and respect the agreement. But agreements require 2 willing parties. If one party simply refuses to acknowledge the agreement exists, treats the land as purely physical resource without spiritual significance, the connection weakens. You can't maintain a bargain with someone who doesn't believe in bargaining." Robert explained that the presence gained power through belief and attention. Samuel's ritual worked by establishing a relationship, creating a framework where the presence was acknowledged and therefore strengthened. Breaking that framework through deliberate violation caused retaliation because it maintained the relationship while disrespecting it. But dissolving the framework entirely through complete disregard and industrial exploitation created different conditions. The presence still existed but couldn't engage effectively with entities that didn't recognize its existence. "It's still there," Robert warned. "It will always be there. But as long as the land is managed impersonally, mechanically, without any individual developing a relationship with the property, it remains largely impotent. The danger returns if someone tries to reconnect, tries to farm traditionally, tries to acknowledge it again. The door is closed, David. Don't let anyone open it again." David felt enormous relief at Robert's explanation and approval. They'd found an exit strategy that didn't require selling to another unsuspecting family, didn't require abandoning their investment entirely, and provided income while they prepared for eventual departure. It wasn't justice. The presence remained, still dangerous to anyone who didn't know the truth. But it was survival, and survival was all David could hope for at this point. The Peterson family's story could have ended there. An imperfect but functional resolution allowing them to gradually extract themselves from the situation. But our second case proves that some properties carry dangers that can't be managed even with perfect knowledge and protocol. This next account comes from Washington County, Iowa, and involves phenomena far more actively malicious than the Petersons' watchful guardian. The Morrison family purchased their farm in 1992, a 400-acre property that had stood vacant for nearly a decade. Unlike the Henderson farm, this property had no warnings attached, no local reputation that preceded it, no elderly former owners available to provide guidance. The previous owners had died in a house fire in 1983, and the property had cycled through several bank foreclosures and failed sales before the Morrisons bought it at auction for a fraction of its assessed value. James and Kelly Morrison were in their early 30s with two young sons, Brandon and Tyler, ages 9 and 6 respectively. James worked as an agricultural consultant and saw the property as an opportunity to practice what he preached: modern, efficient farming using the latest technology and sustainable practices. Kelly was a nurse who planned to work part-time at the county hospital while managing the household and homeschooling the boys. The farmhouse was old but structurally sound, built in 1887 with additions and updates through the decades. Most significantly, it featured a basement, unusual for Iowa farmhouses of that era, which typically had crawl spaces or were built on slabs. This basement was large, encompassing the entire footprint of the original structure, with stone walls, a dirt floor, and evidence of having been used for food storage for over a century. The Morrisons spent their first month cleaning and renovating, addressing minor repairs, painting walls, and modernizing systems where necessary. Kelly focused much of her attention on the basement, which she envisioned converting into a proper storage area and possibly a workshop for James. The space was cluttered with abandoned items from previous owners: old furniture, rusted tools, boxes of papers, and belongings that hadn't been removed after the fire. She began sorting through this material, keeping anything useful and discarding the rest. It was during this cleaning process that Kelly found the journal. It was wedged behind a shelf unit, a leather-bound book with water damage and pages that stuck together in places. She initially set it aside with other papers to be discarded, but curiosity eventually prompted her to examine it more carefully. The journal belonged to someone named Eileen Matthews and was dated 1975 to 1982, ending abruptly 7 months before the fire that killed the property's last inhabitants. Kelly began reading, expecting mundane entries about farm life and daily routines. Instead, she found increasingly disturbing accounts of unexplained phenomena that escalated dramatically over the 7-year span. Eileen Matthews described hearing voices in the basement, always at night, always multiple speakers conversing in low tones she couldn't quite understand. She described objects moving, tools relocated, doors that opened after being closed, items disappearing and reappearing in illogical locations. Most disturbing were Eileen's descriptions of the smell. Beginning in 1977, she began noticing a recurring odor in the house, particularly strong in the basement but occasionally permeating the entire structure. She described it as organic decay, like meat left in summer heat, but accompanied by chemical undertones that made it distinctly unnatural. Her husband Frank had experienced the smell too, according to her entries, and they'd searched repeatedly for sources: dead animals in walls, sewage issues, problems with food storage. They found nothing that explained the intensity and persistence of the odor. The journal's final entries, written in 1982, described Eileen's conviction that something lived in the basement. Not a living thing in any biological sense, but an entity that had claimed the space. They'd invested everything into the property and weren't going to be scared away by a disturbed woman's journal entries written decades ago. Kelly agreed, though more reluctantly, and they continued their renovation plans. The Morrison family's experiences began within 2 weeks of moving in. Brandon, the 9-year-old, woke his parents in the middle of the night claiming someone was talking in his closet. James investigated and found nothing unusual, but Brandon insisted he'd heard clear voices, multiple people having a conversation, coming from behind his closet wall. That wall adjoined the chimney chase, which ran from the basement to the roof. James assumed it was sound traveling up from the basement, perhaps something outside creating echoes through the chimney, and told Brandon to ignore it. But the voices continued nightly, always from the same location, always conversational in tone but never clear enough to distinguish words. Kelly eventually heard them herself while tucking Brandon in one evening. She pressed her ear against the closet wall and listened to what sounded undeniably like multiple people talking quietly in an enclosed space. She could hear inflection, pauses that suggested turn-taking in conversation, even occasional sounds that might be laughter. But the words remained frustratingly indistinct, like listening to a conversation in another room through heavy walls. James drilled a small inspection hole through the wall, expecting to find a gap where sound was channeling from outside or the basement. Instead, he found only the normal construction, insulation, the brick chimney, and no obvious pathway for sound transmission. He patched the hole and bought a white noise machine for Brandon's room, hoping to mask whatever audio phenomenon was creating the illusion of voices. The machine helped Brandon sleep but didn't eliminate the underlying sound. The voices continued, and gradually, other family members began hearing them in other parts of the house, always seeming to come from within walls or behind closed doors. In November, the smell appeared. Kelly noticed it first while doing laundry in the basement. The organic decay scent Eileen Matthews had described was unmistakable and overwhelming. A combination of rot, chemicals, and something else Kelly couldn't identify but found instinctively repulsive. She checked every corner of the basement, examined all storage areas, inspected the furnace and water heater, but found no source. The smell would appear randomly, last for hours or sometimes days, then disappear completely, only to return weeks later without pattern or apparent cause. James finally acknowledged something unusual was occurring when he experienced his first episode of sleep paralysis. He woke in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling immense pressure on his chest, and sensing a presence in the darkened bedroom. This is a recognized medical phenomenon, and James tried to rationalize it as such. But the frequency was unusual, 3 times in 1 week, and the consistency of the accompanying sensations suggested more than random brain misfires. Each time, he felt something in the room, something that moved close to the bed, something that seemed to study him with malevolent attention before the paralysis broke and he could move again. Kelly began keeping her own journal, documenting the phenomena in hopes of identifying patterns. She recorded dates and times of voice occurrences, smell appearances, temperature anomalies, and unusual dreams. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Activity intensified during specific periods. New moon phases, anniversaries of the Matthews fire, and particularly during any construction or renovation work. Every time James attempted basement improvements, the phenomena escalated dramatically for days afterward. By December, young Tyler, only 6 years old, began talking about the people in the basement. He described them in detail, 3 adults and 2 children, though their features were vague and shifted when asked specific questions. He said they were sad and angry, that they lived in the walls, and that they didn't want the Morrison family in the house. Kelly felt ice run down her spine listening to her son's matter-of-fact description of entities he clearly perceived as real. Against James's wishes, Kelly contacted a paranormal investigation team from a university in Iowa City. 3 researchers spent a weekend at the property with recording equipment, thermal cameras, and EMF detectors. Their findings were inconclusive but intriguing. They recorded unexplained temperature drops, captured audio that might be voices but might also be equipment interference, and documented electromagnetic field fluctuations that didn't correspond to any electrical sources. Most compellingly, all 3 researchers independently reported feeling intensely unwelcome in the basement, a psychological pressure they'd never experienced at other investigation sites. "I can't tell you definitively that your house is haunted," the lead researcher told Kelly, "but I can tell you that something about that basement creates measurable environmental anomalies and strong psychological responses. Whether that's residual energy from past trauma, geological factors creating infrasound, or actual entities, I can't say. But I wouldn't let my children spend time in that basement, and I'd be cautious about the entire property." That research visit marked a turning point. Kelly insisted they acknowledge the problem and decide whether to stay or leave. James, finally accepting the situation's seriousness, agreed to a trial period. They'd stay through winter but commit to leaving in spring if phenomena continued or escalated. They'd list the property and accept whatever financial loss resulted. Their children's well-being mattered more than any investment. But something prevented them from leaving. Not physical obstacles, but a series of circumstances that created barriers to departure. James's truck died beyond economical repair. Kelly's hours at the hospital were cut, reducing their income. Brandon developed pneumonia that required extended recovery at home. Each time they made plans to list the property, something occurred that delayed the process. By spring, Kelly began to suspect these weren't coincidences but interference, something that didn't want them to leave. The situation climaxed on the night of August 12, 1993, exactly 11 years after the Matthews fire. Kelly woke to the smell of smoke, strong and immediate, suggesting active fire. She shook James awake, and together they rushed to check the children. Brandon and Tyler were safe in their rooms, but both reported seeing fire in the walls, flames moving behind the plaster, though the walls themselves weren't hot or damaged. James searched the entire house and found no fire, no smoke except the smell, no source for what they were all experiencing. Then, from the basement, they heard screaming. Not voices from recordings or distant sounds, but clear, agonized screaming of multiple people, accompanied by sounds of crackling flames and structural collapse. The Morrison family fled the house in their nightclothes and called the fire department from a neighbor's house. Firefighters arrived and found no fire, no damage, no explanation for what the family described. That was the end of the Morrison family's time on the property. They stayed with relatives, hired a company to pack and move their belongings, and never spent another night in the house. They sold the property at a massive loss to a developer who planned to demolish the structure and subdivide the land. When crews arrived to begin demolition, they refused to continue after the first day. Equipment malfunctions, injuries, and an overwhelming sense of hostility made workers unwilling to return at any price. The house stands abandoned still, 30 years later, slowly collapsing from neglect. The basement, according to those who've dared to explore the deteriorating structure, remains unnaturally cold even in summer, and most who venture down emerge with severe headaches and nausea. Local teenagers sometimes attempt to explore the haunted Morrison farm, but rarely stay more than a few minutes. The property serves as a warning about phenomena that can't be managed, places where human habitation simply isn't tenable regardless of preparation or understanding. These are just 2 of 7 cases we've documented from the Midwest farmland, each demonstrating